I've included these little red cards. You see them around there? They're the classic UU kind of elevator speech kind of thing. I request of you that you carry at least one of these. You can steal additional ones that are in the back up there. Kelly has a bunch, and they're around. And every once in a while, you'll find somebody that you think should be here. Just carry it around. Put it somewhere in your purse or wherever, and hand it to them, and have a moment of evangelism. We could use that. That's probably as effective as any marketing thing we could ever come up with. So, every once in a while we're accused of being a cult. I'm just going to talk about Unitarian Universalism in general. I tell them we're not nearly good enough at recruiting to be given that distinction. Likewise, evangelical megachurches want to think we worship Satan, and I tell them that our services aren't nearly that interesting. Mary Ann Stein was in the parking lot. She stood there. She can attest that I told her that, and she was talking about her and George's sort of church history and faith. And I said, well, we might not be Christian enough for you. And weirdly, that was enough to draw her in. She wanted me to mention that today. I don't know if she's here or not, but let's take a look at the 7 principles. You can have them on your front of your bulletin. They're also going to be right up here, even in fuller form. They've lasted virtually unchanged for almost 30 years. Now, 3 decades is a laughably short legacy for a written document that's religious. However, for the fastest evolving, quickly adaptive religious movement on the planet, not bad. Not bad. Intellectually, since we can't sit still for a moment and sort of can't seem to things lay on the page and sing along in the hymns very easily, then I think it's not too good, not too bad. So, since that is our specialty, right? Our specialty as you use is we're reading ahead in the hymnal to see what we disagree with more than any other faith. The 7 principles and 6 sources, which we'll talk about too, have been woven into our denominational life. They're right in the front of the hymnal, if you ever have one. They're digested enough as a guidepost for us that Beacon Press, the UU-owned book publisher, says that when they pull together or evaluate any criteria for what book they publish, they use those 2 sources as the judgment for what fits for us. So they're a tiny bit like having a creed. The question any UU has to ask themselves is, do they feel like they bind us? I don't feel like they bind us too much anyway. Our principles don't tell you that you can't drink milk while wearing wool or you have to tithe. Our principles here's how I would rephrase the principles for anyone who is coming into the church. Our principles ask you to consider that maybe, if you spiritually feel up to it, you try to see the good in others, try to cooperate in democratic ways that build a peaceful world, think about what your mind and soul really calls you to do and reflect on the interconnected way that things work. That's sort of the way we kind of approach them. They're guidelines. The first of the UU set of principles was adopted in 1961 when we were sort of coming together. It was the fighting points for how we came together, and I want to project them up here and sort of just kind of in a sequence. This was the first 7 principles. There were 6 of them, so we can read along with them. They're similar. You'll notice. I'm not going to read through them, but you'll notice that it's like a rough draft version of what we got. You'll notice a little bit more masculine language in there. You'll notice a little bit more Christian-focused language in there probably too. The earliest version did not come in without any controversy, nor did they live long before they were really challenged. The truth is the 1961 statement that was written to serve was hotly debated to gather the 2 U's together. And we fought over it enough that they nearly prevented the merger. The time then was sort of theological. The heart of the debate was, as we merged, if and how our principles would speak about our Judeo-Christian heritage and roots, and whether to include such phrases as love to God and love to man right in the heart of them. Not that different than today, but a little. Before Universalists and Unitarian could merge, they fought for a nearly 24-hour session over how to deal with the new union, and particularly in its relationship to Christianity, which is, of course, our roots. When you think about how Christian we are, there are really a couple good answers. The more you focus and honor who we were as a movement, the more you feel that the need to honor that is the degree to which you think we're still mostly Christian. The more you focus on the uniqueness from other traditions, on how open and evolving we are, and the degree to which you see us separate from the past is really to the degree to which you think that we're not particularly attached to that faith. The fact that the Universalists remained exclusively Christian for longer, and they already came in humbled. They were sort of poorer and a little bit less in numbers than the Unitarians were, and they were more Christian. It wrinkled the waters even a little bit more. So the merger between our two faiths began percolating in the RE programs. RE programs were brought together and did cross-pollinating stuff from all far back as in the 20s. And in the 60s, we didn't really need each other as much as there were less and less reasons for us to be apart. So eventually we came together without too much rancor and compromise. So they decided they wanted to specifically reference the Jewish and Christian traditions from which we were born, but not tightly define ourselves that way anymore. It's the only really specific religious tradition mentioned. Everything else falls under world religions. But so the fight really was, in the end, it was decided to be framed as not our Judeo-Christian heritage, but the Judeo-Christian heritage. That was a big fighting point. Was it ours or was it the? You know what you use. Put 3 UUs in a room and you got 4 opinions. To cherish and spread the universal truth taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immorally summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man. And Garcia, you thought this was going to be boring. The original 6 stood from 61 to 85, but in the mid-70s, the turn, the uncomfortableness had already started. See, the 70s during the feminist revolution and the era when the earth-based concerns started to rise up for everyone, we were very much affected by that cultural shift. Of course, being the church that invites in cultural trends, or as we like to call it, new revelations, we do like to say that revelation is not sealed. Have you heard that phrase? That's a thing. We don't believe that revelation or truth or emerging truth is sealed historically best in lost, past documents like the Bible. Right? We think that truth evolves and we must evolve with it. That's why we don't have a creed and we have principles. So, as the wisdom of feminism spread, there came a challenge to the extent that how we would relate to the patriarchal history of Christianity, right, particularly the language, became very important, right? And there was a lot of cakes for the Queen of Heaven. Who here participated in that? Anyone? I know Penny would have done that for sure. So Cakes for the Queens of Heaven was a very popular curriculum around biblical verses and that uplifted women and had women's phrases in there. The phrase, the dignity of man, which you saw in there earlier, was underlined, was a particular disdain for these feminists. By the late 70s, it became clear that most U's paying attention, the old U principles, were sexist in the language that they had. They were. The women of the UU Women's Association and the Women's Association and the Service Committee are 2 groups that have a particular connection to the UUA. They sort of have this historic alliance that other connected groups don't have, so they're particularly important. So Women's Association has been a powerful, not so much anymore, but was a powerful force in all churches, or many churches, did a lot of hands-on kind of social justice sort of stuff. Interestingly, our Women's Association had 2 consecutive presidents of the association that went on to become the UUA moderators. And if you know anything about GA, moderators control the conversation about how things get debated. They're really as powerful as the president because when it comes to church law, they sort of moderate that conversation. So they had, in 77, there was a GA resolution titled Women in Religion, which sort of passed unanimously. And that was followed in 79 by a women's conference that affirmed that those principles attacked women, and they were out to sort of change those laws. So they added to definitive no that the principles not only affirmed it in this survey, affirmed them as women, but failed to indicate a respect for the wholeness of life and of the earth. So you can feel the seventh principle kind of emerging in the background as well. So there was an understanding that emerged during all this time that oppression of women and oppression of the earth were connected together. Natalie Gulbranson, who later served as moderator and was also the president, said that she'd listened to a lot of contentious speeches. And she said that the idea of how heated these debates could be were present in her mind. So when that resolution came up, they decided to put it in hold and sort of put it into committee, essentially, and send it out into the congregations to have conversations with it. In 1981, a non-sexist revision of the Principles and Purposes drafted by various women's groups was presented to the General Assembly. It caused great uneasiness again among the more Christian voices in the UU movement, who saw it as tantamount to writing them out of the movement. They sort of felt like they had already taken enough hits, giving up the Christian side of our tradition being lifted up so exclusively. And it was Denny Davidoff who convinced Gulbranson to sort of put it in pause. So they took it out to the denominations. They asked whether they were going to change that specific language from mankind and fatherhood of God. They took a red pen to that. Interestingly enough, brotherhood and fellowship survived the first editorial pens of reform because that was thought to be almost a Christian reference point in the way, right? Brotherhood is kind of sisterhood's kind of a phrase that you have historically in religious language. So, anyway, before the removal of the masculine language, there was a conflict in the air. There was a fear that the process was going to divide the UU Church in those early 80 years, and they were very present to the threat of dividing people because many people who've been involved with the Unitarian Universalism for a long time remember that in the late 60s there was a big walkout in GA over race. There was money promised to an African American caucus, and that money got pulled back, not got of any effort of racism, at least not, active racism. It was more that there was just money not returned, and there was a big fight over that. So there was a concern about this being a divisive issue for Unitarians. So there was a letter sent around the impending debate on whether to amend this. People said it could be a situation where some group wins, but the entire association loses. Ministers called for open dialogue and an appointment of a committee to study the situation. So very sexy at the time in which we're looking at a global conflict, right? However, to make matters better in the world but worse for a sermon, they didn't have a fight. They didn't throw sticks at each other at GA. With fear of the schism, they caused a pause in the vote, and they took it to special committee again. And there were some people who thought it was a stall tactic and the UUA was moving too slowly. The fact that by the early 80s there were so many women in leadership positions that the idea that there were masculine language around ministry in particular needed to change. So, it's exciting? Really nothing about this process, actually. You know what happened next? So from 81 to 85, based on revisions in the 1982 discussions, there was a whole committee, and they suddenly basically brought it for the committee in 84. Wording more or less stood, came up for a second vote in the following year, and passed with only one dissenting vote. You'll note that most of the concepts we have in today's Principles and Purposes have appeared in one form or another. It looked kind of resonant with the old one, right? Similar, at least. And they got out of the Christian quagmire a little bit by adding to the statement known as the sources. Let's read through what we call our sources. These are my favorite parts of it. We're going to look that up here. So this is the sources that define what's sort of in the ballpark of what we call our religion. And they are the direct experience anyone has in a spiritual way, right? Staring at a sunset, or feeling, whatever it is that you feel spiritual about. That's the first thing. Liberal religious people tend to think of experience as being the most authoritative thing we have. It's not scripture, it's not dogma, it's your own experience as a human being. The second one are words and deeds of prophetic people from all over the world, right? They're not just Christian or Jewish, they're just prophetic people, you know, kind of like the president of the Ukraine now. He's almost become a prophetic person, right? We sort of admire those people, and the things they say and the deeds they do inform us. Wisdom from the world's religions which inspire us. So the world religions get a little nod here, right? The whole kind of panorama of Buddhism and all of that. And then we've got the Jewish and Christian teachings, particularly ones that call us to love our neighbor, are cited exclusively, the only ones cited separately. And then humanist teachings, which sort of are the science of things, right? They call us to be judgmental and skeptical. That skeptical side of us is given point of place here too. And then came around in the end, just like the seventh principle did, the world-centered religious traditions, like the history of paganism, not necessarily part of the world religious tradition spectrum, but brought in at the end to honor sort of what's been uplifted for the last 30 years. So there we go. That's the 6 sources that inform our faith. So, in this really exciting story of how we got to us, it's not so much that anyone had a vision of God's truth or of the future. It's not so much that people were content-oriented. We are really much more process-oriented. Much less exciting than in the good old days when you could throw the opposition out the window and their vote didn't count, which is what defenestration is. That's how a lot of the church councils worked out. They would just kick out people till the vote was right. You know? Decide it's okay to invade Congress is sort of in that same spirit, isn't it? But in 1995, we added the phrase referring to the 5 living world religious traditions from which we draw that earth-centered religions. Essentially, minus the anchor, the 7th principle, everything was sort of up to date. The 7th principle, a respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, hadn't really been anticipated. Its inclusion was overwhelmingly mandated in responses from people, and its happy wording as it's described, it's kind of how it's described historically, the happy wording of the 7th principle emerged from the floor, for it was sort of immediately recognized as the right language. So it became unifying, and we've listened to those voices, and we move along. As you know, we have a hard time agreeing on a lot, where the kind of the butt of you jokes is, you know, that we sort of overthink things. And it's appropriate, for within such a small and evolving church, our disagreements sort of haven't been terribly small. We can't decide really essentially whether this is described as worship here or as a Sunday service, right? We go back and forth about how really free and independent we are and how connected we are to our denomination. Just to list a few range of ways UUs can be perplexing, just kind of a fun way to think about how much of a hot mess we are. We don't know if we should have any more allegiance to our Christian roots than we say our Buddhist leanings, right? That's unclear. We have 2 things that probably matter more than anything, and that is this. We know that the idea of tolerance is very important to us. And that comes most poignantly back in the time of the Reformation, where Francis David in Transylvania famously said, does anybody know? Bob? What did Francis David say? Andy? We need not think alike to love alike. Thank you. And that sort of became a touchstone for us, right? And it's a beautiful thing. Like, we can disagree and still sit next to each other. And we've entered also, I would add to that tolerance, a sense of how we are going to be with one another. I'm going to just read through a simple version of the 2nd through 5th of our principles. Just close your eyes and listen. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. acceptance of one another, and the encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, followed by a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. There is no specific truth in there, is there? It's a process. We encourage people to be spiritual in their own ways and for us to be just and equitable in the way that we relate to one another. William Sloane Coffin, a thoughtful activist and outspoken former chaplain at Yale, says, "I like the UUs. They might have a thin theology, but they have a thick ethic." And I think that's true. We have a thick sense of ethics. Walter Jones was referenced earlier, talking a lot about the process. He said that apart from the Quakers and their time-honored desire for consensus, it is unlikely that the history of religion provides any comparable example of such intentional and committed use of inclusive, non-hierarchical processes to produce a guiding statement as ours has. I think we deserve a round of applause for that in a world that can't get along. Essentially, I believe we do religion in a way that nobody else does. We know that it's going to change, and we know that there'll be disagreement about that. So our religion is built first for process and dedicated that way. This is not a small matter. UUs don't believe that the ends justify the means, but that the right means lead to the right ends. I would love to well up with pride here that we are the answer. Sorry, no explosions or anyone getting shot at a General Assembly. It's not that sexy, but deep in my bones, I believe we're the answer. So, it was boring. I know. You know what's good about boring? Nobody gets killed. Nobody gets beaten up or even shut up. Trump would hate our process. But in a context where we as Americans seem to be entertained and insult one another and laugh at each other more decisively and quickly with our chests puffed out, isn't it kind of almost stodgy and old-fashioned and civilized to force ourselves to talk about it? That's your tradition. I'd love to roll out that slow, boring tape of what it would like if UUs were in charge of the world. Wouldn't that be nice? I just wonder if we just couldn't pull it off. And I'll leave you with that lingering thought. Amen.